Ryan Whitmore looked Emily Sterling in the eyes, the woman who had loved him for 5 years, and said without flinching, without apology, without even the decency to lower his voice, "I'm marrying Madison instead." He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't look away. He just stood there calm as a man ordering coffee while her entire world caught fire. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, stay with me because what happened next will shake you to your core. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Sterling had always believed that love was the kind of thing that held when everything else fell apart. She believed it the way you believe in the floor beneath your feet. You don't think about it. You don't question it. You just trust that it will be there every single time you take a step. She had trusted Ryan Whitmore for 5 years. 5 years of early mornings and late nights. 5 years of his hand reaching for hers and the dark of his voice on the phone when she was scared of building something together that felt like it could last a lifetime. He wasn't perfect, she knew that, but she had never once believed he was capable of what he did to her on that Tuesday afternoon in October. It started as an ordinary day. Emily had driven herself to the fitting appointment alone. That was nothing unusual. She was independent by nature, always had been. She'd learned early in life that depending on people too heavily had a way of leaving you exposed. But with Ryan, she had let herself be vulnerable. With Ryan, she had lowered the walls she'd spent years building. She parked her car in the circular driveway of Sterling Ridge Estate and grabbed her garment bag from the back seat. The final fitting for her wedding dress was supposed to take an hour. She was supposed to walk out of there feeling beautiful and ready and certain about her future. Instead, she walked into the beginning of the worst day of her life. The moment she pushed open the heavy front door, something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the kind of wrong that announces itself. It was subtle the way a room feels different when the air has shifted. The kind of wrongness you sense in your chest before your brain catches up. Then she saw them. Her luggage, 2 large suitcases and a weekend bag, was stacked neatly beside the entrance hall table. Her books, her photographs, the small wooden jewelry box her adoptive mother had given her. All of it packed and placed with a kind of deliberate precision that made her stomach drop. Ryan was standing near the fireplace, and beside him, dressed in a cream silk blouse that probably cost more than Emily's monthly rent, stood Madison Carlisle. Emily knew who Madison was. Everyone in their social circle knew who Madison Carlisle was. She was 28 years old, the only daughter of Harlan Carlisle, a man whose wealth had been described in financial publications as generational in a way that most billionaires only dream about. Madison was beautiful in the polished, maintained way that comes with money and time and access to things most people never see. She had the kind of effortless confidence that Emily had always quietly envied. But she had never imagined that Madison Carlisle would be standing in her home beside her fiancé, with an expression on her face that could only be described as satisfied. "Ryan," Emily's voice came out steadier than she felt. "What is this?" Ryan didn't move toward her. He stayed where he was, hands clasped in front of him, and he looked at her the way you look at a problem you've already solved, resolved, finished, like she was already in the past. "Emily," he said, and his voice was so measured, so controlled, that she felt a fresh wave of nausea. "We need to talk. That's my luggage by the door." It wasn't a question. It was a statement spoken quietly because she needed to hear the words out loud to make herself believe them. "Yes. Why is my luggage by the door, Ryan?" He exhaled. One slow, deliberate breath, and then he said it. "I'm marrying Madison instead." The words landed like something physical. Emily didn't cry. She didn't scream. She stood very still, the garment bag hanging from her hand, and she felt the floor tilt beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with balance and everything to do with the sudden, violent rearranging of reality. "I'm sorry," he added, and the apology was so hollow, so utterly disconnected from anything resembling genuine remorse that she almost laughed. "You're sorry." She repeated it back to him. Flat, empty. "This isn't personal, Emily." "Not personal." She set the garment bag down slowly. She was aware in some distant part of her mind that her hands were shaking. "You're ending our engagement 3 weeks before our wedding with another woman standing next to you in our home, and you're telling me it's not personal. Madison shifted slightly. She had the grace at least to look mildly uncomfortable, but she didn't leave the room. Ryan straightened. He looked like a man who had rehearsed this conversation and was determined to get through it efficiently. My family is in a difficult financial position. You know that. The estate, the investments, everything, it's been deteriorating for years. Harlan Carlisle has made an offer that would save everything, but it requires you marrying his daughter. Emily finished the sentence for him. Her voice was like glass. So this is a business transaction. It's a necessity. And I'm what collateral damage 5 years, Ryan. 5 years. And you're standing there telling me that I'm... She stopped, swallowed. That I'm not worth as much as her bank account. Something flickered across his face. Not guilt. Not quite. It was something closer to discomfort, the expression of a man who knows he's doing something wrong, but has already decided to do it anyway. I care about you, he said. I always will, but I have responsibilities to my family, to this estate, to... Don't. The word came out sharp and quiet. Don't tell me about responsibility. Don't stand there and use that word with me. Emily, does your mother know? She looked around the room. Where is she? Ryan hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. Margaret Whitmore appeared in the doorway of the sitting room. She was a tall woman, silver-haired, with the kind of composure that comes from decades of performing grace under pressure. Emily had tried, genuinely tried, to build a relationship with her over 5 years. She had brought her flowers. She had remembered her birthday. She had sat across from her at dinner tables and tried to earn her approval the way a woman does when she loves a man whose mother is difficult to love. Margaret looked at her now with an expression that Emily could only describe as relief. Not pity, not regret. Relief. Margaret. Emily's voice broke on the name just slightly. Did you know about this? It's for the best, dear. Her voice was kind in the way that certain cruelties disguise themselves as kindness. You're a lovely girl, but Ryan has obligations. I'm a lovely girl. Emily repeated the words, slowly tasting them. I'm a lovely girl, but not quite worth keeping. That's not what I said. That's exactly what you said. Emily looked at the three of them, Ryan, Margaret, Madison, and she understood something in that moment with brutal, crystalline clarity. This wasn't a surprise. This had been planned. The luggage was already packed. The conversation was already rehearsed. They had decided, and they had done it without her, and they expected her to gather her things and disappear quietly. She bent down and picked up the handle of her largest suitcase. You're not even going to fight for us? Ryan asked. And the audacity of that question, the absolute breathtaking nerve of asking that question while Madison Carlisle stood 3 feet away, made something harden inside Emily's chest. She looked at him for a long moment. There's nothing left to fight for, she said, and she walked out. The rain started the moment she stepped outside. Not a gentle rain, a hard, punishing October rain that plastered her hair to her face and soaked through her jacket before she reached the car. She loaded her suitcases into the trunk with shaking hands, the garment bag still hanging from her shoulder, the wedding dress still in its bag that she had chosen and fitted and imagined herself wearing on the happiest day of her life. She sat behind the wheel for 3 minutes without starting the car. Then she drove away. She didn't know where she was going. She drove on instinct muscle memory, carrying her down roads she had traveled 100 times, and she didn't cry until she hit the highway. And then she cried in a way she hadn't cried since she was a child, ugly and broken and completely without restraint. By the time she reached the small apartment she had been using as an office space near the city, she was hollow. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from emotional destruction, the kind that leaves you unable to make decisions, unable to form complete thoughts, able only to sit on the edge of a bed and stare at a wall. That was where she spent the first night. Her phone rang 11 times in the first 3 hours. Friends, colleagues, her wedding planner who had heard somehow because bad news moves faster than light. She answered none of them. The only person she thought about calling was her adoptive mother, Helen. Helen Sterling, the quiet, steady woman who had raised her with nothing but love and patience, and the kind of wisdom that never announced itself as wisdom. Helen, who had passed away 14 months ago after a brief, devastating illness that had taken her so quickly, Emily still sometimes forgot in the first moments of waking that she was gone. She lay in the dark and talked to Helen in her head the way she had been doing since the funeral. "I thought he was a good man," she said out loud to the empty room. "I really thought he was." She fell asleep with her clothes on and her phone face down on the nightstand. The next morning she made a decision. She couldn't stay in the city. She couldn't sit in that apartment surrounded by the wreckage of her former life. The calendar with the wedding date still circled the receipts from the venue deposit, the save the date she hadn't finished addressing. She needed to be somewhere that belonged to her, somewhere that felt safe. Helen's house, the small coastal property in Maine that Helen had left to her. Emily had been avoiding it since the funeral. Too many memories, too much of Helen's presence still in the walls. But right now, that presence was exactly what she needed. She packed what she had, the 2 suitcases from the estate, and she drove north. The house was exactly as she'd left it, small and blue-shuttered, settled between a stand of birch trees and a rocky shoreline. It smelled like salt air and old wood and something floral that she couldn't identify. Helen's perfume may be absorbed into the walls over decades of living. The electricity was still connected. The pipes still worked. There was canned food in the pantry and a blanket on the couch that Emily pulled over herself and didn't move from for 2 full days. She didn't answer her phone. She didn't return messages. She let the world go on without her. On the 3rd day, she started to emerge slightly. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the water. She ate something that wasn't crackers. On the 4th day, she started going through Helen's papers, not looking for anything specific, just moving through the house in a way that felt like maintenance, like she was taking care of things, because taking care of things was the only way she knew how to move forward when the center had collapsed. The attic was her last stop. She had climbed the narrow stairs with a flashlight and a vague intention of checking for any signs of water damage after the storm 2 days ago. The beam of light moved across cardboard boxes and old furniture and the accumulated quiet of decades. Then she saw the wet patch in the corner, a leak. Small, but definite, the boards around it slightly swollen and darkened. She moved toward it, carefully testing the floor with her weight, and as she knelt to examine the damage, she noticed something that made her stop. A section of the floorboard near the corner had been disturbed. Not broken, not rotted, deliberately moved and then replaced, and then time had done the rest of the work, settling the boards back into something that almost looked untouched, but not quite. Emily sat back on her heels. She pulled her flashlight closer, and she started to look more carefully. It took her 40 minutes to work the boards free with a flathead screwdriver she found in Helen's utility kit. Her hands were dirty, and her knees ached, and the rain was drumming against the roof above her, and when the boards finally gave way, revealing a hollow space beneath, she almost expected to find nothing. What she found instead was an iron chest, old, heavy, bound with a lock that had already corroded open with age. Emily sat on the attic floor with the chest in her lap, and she opened the lid. Inside were journals, legal documents, photographs, old ones, formal and posed of people she didn't recognize. A sealed envelope with her name on it, written in Helen's handwriting. Trust documents with names she'd never heard. And beneath all of it, several folded sheets of legal paper that had been pressed flat and preserved with what looked like deliberate care. She picked up the envelope with her name on it first. Her hands were not entirely steady as she broke the seal. Helen's handwriting was familiar as a heartbeat. She had seen it on birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen table for 30 years. But what the handwriting said was not familiar at all. "My darling Emily," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I've gone before I was able to tell you everything I should have told you long ago. I have kept this secret because I believed I was protecting you. I hope you will understand. I hope you will forgive me. But more than anything, I hope that what you find in this chest will give you something that I could not, a true understanding of who you are." Emily read the letter twice. Then she set it down. Then she picked up the first journal. She read through the night. The rain didn't stop. The flashlight batteries died, and she replaced them from a drawer downstairs and climbed back up. She sat in the cold attic with a blanket around her shoulders, and she read page by page the story that Helen had kept hidden for 25 years. Her adoptive mother had not simply been a kind woman who had opened her home to a foster child. Helen Sterling had once worked for one of the most powerful families in American history. The Sterling dynasty industrialists, landowners, philanthropists, whose name had shaped whole sectors of the American economy for 150 years. She had served as the personal assistant to Catherine and Robert Sterling, the last direct heirs to that dynasty, until one October evening 25 years ago when a private yacht went down in a storm off the coast of Maine. Catherine and Robert Sterling died in that accident. Their 2-year-old daughter, the sole heir of the Sterling family, was listed as missing and presumed dead. But Helen Sterling, no relation to the dynasty, the last name a coincidence that had felt over years of reading these journals like something more had pulled that child from the water herself. She had been on the dock that night. She had seen something in the water. She had gone in after it. She had pulled out a small, barely conscious girl with dark hair and gray eyes and a birthmark on her left shoulder in the shape of a crescent moon. Emily's left hand went to her shoulder without thinking. She had had that birthmark her entire life. She turned back to the journals. Her heart was beating so loudly she could hear it. Helen had not gone to the authorities. The journals explained why in painful, careful detail. There had been people looking for that child not to save her, but to eliminate the last living heir and ensure that the Sterling estate would be absorbed by competing interests. Helen had seen things in the weeks leading up to the accident that had terrified her. She had witnessed conversations she wasn't supposed to witness. She had understood, with the clarity of a woman who had spent years in service to powerful people, that bringing that child to the surface would put her directly in the path of people who wanted her gone. So she had kept her. She had raised her as her own. She had named her Emily and loved her and protected her, and carried the weight of this secret through every single year of her life, waiting for the right moment to tell her, always believing there would be more time. The documents at the bottom of the chest were even more extraordinary. Trust agreements, establishing in clear legal language that the entirety of the Sterling estate, including all property holdings, investments, and subsidiary interests, was to be held in trust for the surviving heir of the Sterling line until that heir reached the age of 27. Emily had turned 27 in March, but that was not the detail that stopped her breathing entirely. Buried among the property records was an original land charter dated 1887, establishing the boundaries and ownership terms of a significant parcel of land in the Hudson Valley. A parcel that included, based on the coordinates and descriptions she cross-referenced with 3 different documents, the entirety of what was currently known as Whitmore Estate, Ryan's estate, the estate where he had stood beside another woman and told Emily she wasn't worth keeping. The land had been leased, not sold, by the Sterling family to the Whitmore family in 1923, for a term of 50 years, renewable under specific conditions that the Whitmore family had never met. The lease had expired in 1973. They had simply never left. For 50 years, the Whitmore family had been living on land that belonged to Emily's family. Ryan had proposed to her on that land. He had broken her heart on that land, and it had been hers the entire time. Emily set the document down with hands that had gone completely still. For a long moment, she didn't move at all. Then she picked up her phone. Her first call was to a lawyer she had worked with briefly on a small inheritance matter after Helen's passing. She woke him up at 2 a.m, and she said very calmly and very clearly, "I need you to connect me with the best estate attorneys in the country, and I need you to do it before morning." He heard something in her voice, something new, something that hadn't been there before, and he didn't ask questions. "I'll make calls," he said. "Good." She looked down at the documents spread across the attic floor around her, at the photographs of the Sterling family, at a formal portrait of Catherine and Robert Sterling, standing in front of a grand estate with a small, dark-haired girl on Catherine's hip who had gray eyes and a birthmark on her left shoulder. She looked at the photographs for a long time. "My name is Emily Catherine Sterling," she said out loud, testing the words, feeling the weight of them. And then she started making a list of everything that was going to happen next. She didn't sleep that night, not a single hour. Emily sat in that attic until the sky outside the small octagonal window shifted from black to gray to the pale, reluctant blue of early morning, and she read every single document in that iron chest twice, some of them 3 times. Not because she didn't understand them, because she was afraid that understanding them too quickly would mean they weren't real, that she would blink and they would dissolve back into ordinary paper and she would still be just Emily, the woman who had been discarded 3 weeks before her wedding, who had driven to Maine with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. But they didn't dissolve. Every time she read them, they said the same thing. By 6 in the morning, she had organized everything into 3 piles on the attic floor: legal documents, personal records, photographs, and journals. Her hands were steadier now than they had been at 2 a.m. There was something happening inside her chest that she didn't have a word for yet. Something between grief and fury, and a strange electric sense of purpose that she had never felt before in her life. Like a current being switched on after years of running on nothing. Her phone buzzed at 6:14. It was the lawyer she had called in the middle of the night. His name was Daniel Forsyth, and he was careful and thorough and not easily rattled, which was why she had called him first. "I've made contact with 3 firms," he said without preamble. "One in New York, one in Boston, one in Washington. All of them specialize in estate law and legacy claims. I told them it was urgent and significant. All 3 are willing to take a preliminary call this morning." "Good," Emily said. "Set them all up, one after another." A pause. "Emily, I have to ask, how significant is this? Because I'm calling in a considerable number of favors here, and I need to know." "Daniel?" She picked up the land charter and held it in both hands. "I need you to trust me when I tell you that this is the most significant thing you will be involved in for the rest of your career." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll set up the calls," he said. The first call was at 7:30, the second at 9, the third at 10:15. By noon, Emily had spoken to 6 attorneys, 3 of them senior partners at firms that handled cases most people only read about in financial newspapers. She spoke clearly and methodically. She described what she had found. She answered their questions without embellishment. She sent photographs of the documents from her phone, standing in the attic with her hand braced against a roof beam, photographing page after page in the gray morning light. The reactions were telling. The first attorney went quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "Ms. Sterling, if these documents are what they appear to be, you may be looking at one of the largest unclaimed estate recoveries in American history." "I know," she said. "You need a forensic document examiner immediately, and a genealogical specialist, and a DNA test." "I know," she said again. "That's why I'm calling you." By the end of the day, she had retained 2 firms and had a team being assembled. By the end of the week, she had a geneticist, 2 forensic document specialists, a private investigator named Carl Brewer, who had spent 30 years working estate fraud cases, and an attorney named Vivian Marsh, who had a reputation in legal circles as someone who did not lose. Vivian Marsh called her on a Thursday evening 4 days after Emily's first contact with Daniel Forsyth, and she was direct in the way that only people who have been in courtrooms for 20 years learn to be direct. "I've reviewed everything you sent," Vivian said. "The preliminary forensic analysis on the land charter is back. The document is authentic. The ink, the paper composition, the notarial seal, everything is consistent with the date of origin. This is not a forgery." Emily sat down on the edge of the couch. "Okay," she said. "The trust documents are also authentic. The genealogical team has confirmed that the Sterling family line is traceable and that there was a surviving heir from the yacht accident. The question is whether we can prove that surviving heir is you." Vivian's voice was measured, but there was something underneath it, the particular energy of an attorney who has just seen a case they know they can win. The birthmark alone won't be enough, but the DNA test will be. "When will we have those results?" "We expedited. 10 days, possibly less. 10 days. Emily looked at the chest, now sitting on Helen's kitchen table with the documents carefully sorted inside it. 10 days of waiting while Ryan Whitmore stood in a house that didn't belong to him planning a wedding to a woman he was buying himself out of ruin with. "What happens in the meantime?" she asked. "In the meantime," Vivian said, "you do not contact Ryan Whitmore Madison Carlisle. or anyone connected to them. You do not discuss this with friends or family. You do not post anything on social media. You are, as far as anyone who knew your previous life is concerned, simply a woman who had her heart broken and went to Maine to recover. And the estate, the land charter. If they're planning the wedding at the estate, let them plan, Vivian said. And there was something in her tone that made Emily's pulse quicken. In fact, it would be better for us if they proceed. Every dollar invested into that property, every contract signed, every vendor paid, it all becomes relevant. Let them build the stage. We'll deal with the performance when the time comes. Emily was quiet for a moment. Vivian, she said slowly, Madison's father is transferring money into the estate. Significant money. Ryan told me his family was essentially being financially rescued through this marriage. Another silence. This one shorter. How much money are we talking about? Based on what Ryan mentioned before, everything fell apart. He said Harlan Carlisle had committed to $50 million. The silence on the other end of the phone was the most satisfying sound Emily had heard in weeks. Emily, Vivian said carefully, under the terms of the original land charter, every capital improvement, every financial investment made into that property by any party other than the legitimate owner belongs to the legitimate owner, Emily finished. Every dollar. Vivian's voice was quiet now, with the particular quiet of someone doing math in their head and arriving at a number that demands respect. If Harlan Carlisle transfers $50 million into Whitmore Estate before we execute our claim, then it belongs to me. Neither of them spoke for 3 full seconds. Don't do anything, Vivian said finally. Don't warn them. Don't make contact. Let the money move. Emily looked out the kitchen window at the gray water. Understood, she said. The DNA results came back in 9 days. Vivian called at 7 in the morning, which told Emily everything before a single word was spoken. Attorneys who have bad news call during business hours. Attorneys who have extraordinary news cannot wait. It's a match, Vivian said. The genetic profile is consistent with the Sterling family line. The forensic genealogists have cross-referenced 3 separate biological markers. Emily, it's definitive. You are the surviving heir of the Sterling dynasty. Emily had known it was coming. She had known since the attic on some cellular level, the way the body sometimes understands truth, before the mind is ready to accept it. But hearing it spoken out loud plainly and factually by a person who had spent 9 days verifying it was something different. She pressed her hand flat against the kitchen table. "What do we do next?" she asked, and her voice was absolutely calm. "We move," Vivian said. "We have the documentation. We have the DNA. We have the forensic verification. I'm filing the initial claim with the court this week. At the same time, we're filing the property action on the Whitmore estate, and I need you in New York, not next week, now." Emily was already moving toward the bedroom. "I'll be on the road in an hour," she said. She packed the iron chest into the back seat of her car, wrapped in a blanket, because it felt wrong to let it out of her sight. She locked Helen's house and stood on the front step for a moment, looking at the birch trees and the water, and she said quietly to the woman who was no longer there, "I found it, Helen. I found everything." Then she got in the car and drove south. The next 3 weeks were unlike anything Emily had experienced. She had always been a capable woman, organized, intelligent, good under pressure. But what Vivian Marsh built around her in those weeks was something different. It was an operation. Systematically, methodically, and with extraordinary speed, a team of 12 legal professionals began assembling the most comprehensive estate claim case Emily had ever heard of, and she was at the center of it. She sat in conference rooms for 12 hours at a stretch, answering questions from attorneys and genealogists and forensic accountants. She reviewed documents until the legal language stopped feeling foreign and started feeling like a second language she was learning fluency in. She submitted to additional DNA verification, 3 rounds of it, because Vivian wanted the claim to be airtight from every conceivable direction. Carl Brewer, the private investigator, provided regular updates on the situation at Whitmore Estate. He was a compact, quiet man who had a gift for appearing unremarkable, and the information he delivered was anything but. The transfer happened, he told her 3 weeks into her time in New York. He set a folder on the conference table and slid it toward her. $50 million from Harlan Carlyle's holding company into the Whitmore Family Trust. It cleared 4 days ago. Emily looked at the wire transfer documentation. "What's it earmarked for?" Vivian asked. "Renovation of the main house estate debt clearance and funding for what is being described as the wedding event of the decade." Carl's expression was professionally neutral, but his eyes said something else. "They've booked the entire venue for 4 days, catering for 400 guests, a celebrity officiant. Media coverage, 3 of the major society publications have been given exclusive access." "Of course they have," Emily said. "They've also hired a new estate manager and begun interviewing household staff. The previous staff who were present when—" He glanced at Emily briefly. "When the previous arrangement ended, most of them signed NDAs." "About what?" Emily asked. Carl met her eyes. "About the fact that several of them witnessed the confrontation. One of them, a woman named Patricia, who worked as the kitchen manager for 11 years, refused to sign. She's been let go." Something moved through Emily's expression. "Is she reachable?" "Already reached," Carl said. Emily looked at Vivian. "She's willing to provide a statement," Vivian said, "about what she witnessed and about several other things she observed over the years that are, let's say, contextually relevant to the broader picture." "What other things?" Vivian folded her hands on the table. This was the gesture she used before delivering information that changed the shape of everything. "Carl's team has been going through historical records, property records, correspondence, financial filings going back 20 years. And Patricia's statement, combined with what we found in those records, has opened a thread that we did not expect to find." Emily waited. "Margaret Whitmore," Vivian said. "Ryan's mother." Emily's jaw tightened slightly. "What about her?" Patricia recalls an incident approximately 8 years ago, a meeting in the estate library late at night between Margaret and a man she didn't recognize. She overheard part of the conversation. At the time, it meant nothing to her, but in light of what we now know— Vivian opened a second folder. The man Patricia described matches the description of a former attorney named Gerald Ashby, who worked for a group of investors who had been trying since the early 2000s to acquire assets from the Sterling estate during the period when the heir was presumed dead. The room was completely silent. "Margaret knew," Emily said. "We believe Margaret had acquired information we don't yet know how, suggesting that the missing Sterling heir might still be alive. And rather than act on that information in any legitimate way, she appears to have sold it." Emily stared at her. "She sold information about my existence." The words came out very quietly. "To people who had a financial interest in ensuring you never came forward to claim your inheritance." Vivian's voice was carefully steady. "We are still investigating the full scope of what was exchanged and what was done with that information. But what we know for certain is that Margaret Whitmore was aware for years that you might be who you are, and she said nothing, to anyone, including her own son." Emily sat very still. This was the moment when everything shifted again, because until now, as devastating as Ryan's betrayal had been, some part of her had been able to assign it a category she understood. Greed, weakness, the failure of a man who chose money over love. Those were human failures, comprehensible ones. But this was different. This meant that when Margaret Whitmore had looked her in the face and said, "It's for the best, dear," she had known. She had known who Emily was, or suspected it strongly enough to sell the information to people who wanted her silenced, and she had stood there in that entrance hall and smiled and watched Emily pick up her suitcases and walk out into the rain. "Ryan," Emily said slowly, "does Ryan know?" "We don't believe so," Carl said. "Based on everything we've found, his knowledge of his mother's activities appears to be limited. He has his own sins to account for, but this particular one may genuinely belong to Margaret alone." Emily stood up from the table. She walked to the window and looked out at the city, the endless, indifferent city that continued moving regardless of what happened in conference rooms 17 floors above it. She stood there for a long moment. "Add it to the case," she said. "Emily, add it to the case." She turned back to the room. Her face was composed in a way that took the people who had been working with her for 3 weeks a moment to recognize. It wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It was resolved in a way that went deeper than emotion. Everything, every thread, every document, Every piece of information Carl's team has found about what Margaret knew and when she knew it and who she told. I want it all in front of the court." Vivian nodded slowly. "Then we need to talk about timing," she said, "because the wedding is in 3 weeks." Emily sat back down. "Tell me everything," she said. The preparation for what Vivian's team began privately calling the execution was surgical in its precision. Every piece of legal documentation had been verified by multiple independent experts. The DNA evidence had been certified by a federally accredited laboratory. The land charter had been authenticated by 2 separate forensic specialists and confirmed by a professor of historical property law at Columbia University, who had described it in his written report as unambiguous in its language and unquestionably binding under current property law. The plan was simple in its architecture and devastating in its implications. Court orders would be filed the morning of the wedding. Property injunctions, asset freezes, and eviction notices would be served simultaneously. They had timed everything to ensure that the legal action would be fully in motion before the ceremony began, not from cruelty, but from strategy. Because a wedding with 400 witnesses was a public event, and the service of legal documents at a public event created a record that was nearly impossible to challenge or suppress. "They will try to fight it," Vivian warned her on the eve of the day. They were in the conference room late, the 2 of them, the city glittering outside the windows. "Let them," Emily said. "Harlan Carlisle will be furious. He's a man accustomed to buying his way out of problems. When he realizes that $50 million has effectively been transferred to you, he will come at us with everything he has." "Good." Emily looked at her. "I want him to come. I want every lawsuit he files to go on record. I want every argument his attorneys make to be documented and examined and answered. Because the truth doesn't need me to protect it, Vivian. The truth is right there in black and white in documents that were filed in 1887, and no amount of Harlan Carlisle's money is going to make those documents say something different." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "You're not the same woman who called Daniel Forsythe in the middle of the night," she said finally. It wasn't a criticism. It was an observation. Emily thought about that. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." She thought about the girl who had driven to Maine with 2 suitcases and a broken heart, and no idea what was waiting for her in an attic beneath a leaking roof. She thought about Helen, who had kept this secret for 25 years, out of love and fear, and the impossible weight of trying to protect someone from a world that wanted to take things from her. She thought about Ryan standing at the altar in a house that had never belonged to him, waiting for a woman he had bought instead of loved. And she thought about the moment that was coming, the convoy of cars, the documents in hand, the 400 witnesses, the look on his face when he understood that everything he had built on lies was about to come down. She didn't feel triumphant exactly. She had expected triumph, and instead what she felt was something quieter and far more solid, like standing on ground that had always been hers and finally knowing it. "Get some rest," Vivian said. "Tomorrow is going to be long." Emily nodded. She picked up her coat. She walked to the elevator. In the lobby, she paused. She took out her phone and looked at it for a moment at the contact listed as Ryan, which she had not deleted and had not called in 6 weeks. She put the phone back in her pocket. There was nothing left to say tonight. Tomorrow, the documents would say it for her, and they would say it in a language that no amount of charm or grief or desperate apology could argue with. The language of truth, the language of law, the language of a family that had waited 25 years for its heir to come home. She walked out into the night, and she was ready. She was awake at 4:30 in the morning, not because an alarm had gone off, not because she had set one. She simply opened her eyes in the dark of the hotel room, and she was completely, perfectly awake the way you are when your body understands that something enormous is about to happen and decides that sleep is no longer relevant. She lay still for exactly 2 minutes. Then she got up. She showered. She dressed. She had chosen the outfit 3 days ago with the same deliberateness she had brought to every other decision in the past 6 weeks. A crimson power suit, tailored, structured, the kind of red that doesn't whisper. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself for a long moment. The woman looking back at her was not the woman who had stood in the rain outside Sterling Ridge Estate 6 weeks ago with wet hair and shaking hands and 2 suitcases that contained the whole of her dismantled life. That woman was gone. Emily Catherine Sterling picked up her phone and called Vivian. "We're ready," Vivian said before Emily could speak. "The court orders were filed at midnight. The injunctions are active. Carl's team is already in position. The process servers are staged at 3 locations. The convoy leaves at 9:15. "And the money?" Emily asked. "The asset freeze was executed this morning at 6 a.m. All Whitmore family accounts, including the holding accounts connected to Harlan Carlisle's transfer, are locked." A pause. $52,400,000. When they added the renovation expenditures to the initial transfer, it came out slightly higher than we anticipated. Emily closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Good," she said. "Emily." Vivian's voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more direct. "How are you?" "I'm ready." "That's not what I asked." Emily looked at her reflection again, at the woman in red, at the gray eyes that had once belonged to Catherine Sterling, that had looked out of family photographs taken 27 years ago, that had been pulled from cold water by a woman who loved her enough to carry a secret to her grave. "I'm both things at once," Emily said honestly. "I'm ready and I'm terrified, and I know exactly what I'm doing." "Is that a good enough answer?" "That," Vivian said, "is the most honest answer you've given me since we met." The hotel lobby at 7 a.m. was quiet. Emily sat at a corner table with coffee she didn't drink and the morning's briefing documents that she had already memorized. Carl Brewer arrived at 7:20 and sat across from her without ceremony. "Guest count confirmed at 387, he said. "The ceremony is scheduled for 11. Based on the catering timeline and the vendor movements we've been tracking, the guests will be fully assembled by 10:30. He set a folder on the table. "I also have an update on Patricia." Emily looked up. Patricia, the kitchen manager who had been fired for refusing to sign the NDA, had agreed to be present today. Not as a witness in any official capacity, just present. It had been her choice entirely, and Emily had told Carl not to pressure her in either direction. "She's coming," Carl said. "She told me to tell you, and I'm quoting directly, 'I watched that girl walk out into the rain with nothing, and I'm going to be there when she walks back in.'" Emily looked down at the table for a moment. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." At 9:15, 4 black SUVs pulled out of the hotel parking structure in a line. Emily sat in the second vehicle with Vivian on one side and a junior attorney named Marcus on the other. Marcus was 29 and had been on Vivian's team for 3 years and was making a genuine effort to look professionally composed, which Emily found almost endearing, given that his hands were gripping his briefcase handle with considerable intensity. "First time at something like this?" she asked him. He looked at her. "Is it that obvious?" "You'll be fine," she said. He nodded. Swallowed, looked back at his briefcase. She almost smiled. They drove in silence for the last 20 minutes. Emily watched the landscape change through the window, the gradual shift from city to suburb to the particular open sky of the Hudson Valley, the land that had belonged to her family for 150 years, that she had driven through dozens of times without knowing it was hers. She knew it now. At 10:47, the convoy turned onto the private road that led to Sterling Ridge Estate. The gates were open. Of course, they were 400 guests had been arriving all morning. Emily watched the property appear through the window, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not satisfaction, something closer to recognition, like seeing a face you've known in photographs finally in person. The lead SUV stopped at the gate. The process server in the front car stepped out, and the whole operation began moving with the precision that 6 weeks of meticulous planning had made possible. Emily stayed in her vehicle for exactly 4 minutes while the initial legal instruments were delivered to the estate's new manager at the gate. She watched through the window as the man read the documents, read them again, and reached for his radio. "It's starting," Vivian said quietly. Emily opened the door and stepped out. She had been to this estate many times. She had walked these grounds as Ryan's fiancée, as the woman he'd been planning to marry, as someone who had always felt slightly out of place in the grandeur of it, without quite knowing why. She understood now. She hadn't felt out of place because she didn't belong here. She had felt the particular discomfort of ownership that doesn't know itself yet. She walked toward the main entrance. Inside, the ceremony space had been transformed. 400 chairs arranged in perfect rows, white flowers everywhere. A string quartet that had been playing and had now gone silent as the estate manager's radio call rippled through the event staff like a current. Guests in expensive clothes turned to look at the entrance. Whispers moved through the crowd. Emily walked down the center. She was aware of the looks. She registered them the way you register weather, as a fact of the environment, not a personal condition. Some people recognized her. She could see it in the double takes, the sharp intakes of breath, the nudging of neighbors. She had been, until 6 weeks ago, Ryan Whitmore's fiancée. Several of these guests had been on the invitation list for the original wedding. She kept walking. Ryan was standing at the altar at the far end of the room. He was wearing a morning suit, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had dressed for the most important transaction of his life and was now watching something approach that he hadn't planned, for his face cycling through expressions too quickly for any of them to settle. Confusion. Recognition. Something that might have been hope and then died immediately when he registered what Emily was wearing and who was walking beside her. Emily. Her name in his mouth across a room full of 400 people who had gone almost completely silent. What is you doing here? She didn't stop walking until she was close enough to be heard clearly without raising her voice. Good morning, Ryan, she said. Pleasant, measured, the way you greet someone at a professional meeting. You need to leave. He stepped forward, lowering his voice to something urgent and private, though the room's acoustics made privacy essentially impossible. This is my wedding day, whatever you think you're doing. I'm not here to stop your wedding, Emily said calmly. I'm here because I have legal obligations to fulfill. What happens after that is entirely up to you. Legal. He stopped. He looked past her at Vivian, at Marcus, at the additional attorneys who had followed Emily into the room, each of them holding documents. His face changed. What is this? Vivian stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, she said in the particular register that senior attorneys use when they want to be clearly heard by everyone in a room while appearing to address only one person. My name is Vivian Marsh. I represent Emily Catherine Sterling, sole surviving heir of the Sterling family dynasty and rightful owner of this property. I'm here to inform you that a court order has been issued this morning establishing Miss Sterling's legal ownership of Sterling Ridge Estate and all attached land holdings. Additionally, all financial accounts associated with the Whitmore Family Trust have been frozen pending resolution of the property claim and related legal actions. The silence that followed was of the complete physical variety, the kind where 400 people stop breathing at the same time. Ryan stared at Vivian, then at Emily, then back at Vivian. That's insane, he said. His voice had a crack in it. That's absolutely insane. This property has belonged to my family for generations. It has been occupied by your family, Vivian said, under a lease agreement that expired in 1973. The original land charter is clear, Mr. Whitmore. Your family has been living on Sterling property for over 50 years on the basis of a lease that was never renewed and never legally transferred. That's not... He turned to the guests as if the room could provide him something useful. This is harassment. This is Ryan. Emily spoke his name quietly, and something in the way she said it cut through the noise he was making. He stopped. He looked at her. She held his gaze. My name, she said clearly for the room, is Emily Catherine Sterling. I was born Catherine and Robert Sterling's daughter. I was the child on that yacht 25 years ago. I was pulled out of the water by a woman who loved me enough to protect me for the rest of her life. And this property, this estate belongs to my family. It always has. Ryan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The accounts are frozen, Emily continued. That includes the transfer your future father-in-law made 4 days ago. $52 million now in legal hold because every dollar invested into this property by any party other than the rightful owner belongs to the rightful owner. That's not a threat, Ryan. That's property law. That's been property law since 1887. In the back of the room there was a movement. Harlan Carlyle was on his feet. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that came from decades of being the most powerful person in any room he entered. His face was the particular shade of red that belongs to men who are not accustomed to being surprised. "This is a fraud," he announced loudly enough that the entire room heard it. "This is a coordinated attack. My attorneys will have every one of these documents thrown out by the end of the week." Vivian turned to face him with a composure that was almost serene. "Mr. Carlyle," she said, "the DNA verification has been certified by a federally accredited laboratory. The land charter has been authenticated by 2 independent forensic specialists and confirmed by a professor of historical property law at Columbia. The court order in my hand was signed by a federal judge at 11:58 last night. You are welcome to engage your attorneys. We look forward to addressing their arguments in court." Harlan Carlyle stared at her. "Every dollar of that transfer," Vivian added almost gently, "is subject to the property claim. I would strongly advise you to speak to your legal team before saying anything further." Madison appeared from somewhere near the altar. She had been, Emily realized, standing to one side this whole time, still in her wedding dress, a magnificent thing of ivory silk that had probably cost more than most people's cars. She looked at her father, then at Ryan, then at Emily. Her expression went through several things very quickly: shock, calculation, and then, with the speed of a woman who had been raised in the world of high-stakes decisions, a kind of cold clarity. "Daddy," she said. Her voice was controlled but tight at the edges. "Tell me this isn't real." Harlan was already on his phone. He turned away from his daughter to speak into it in a low, furious voice. Madison turned to Ryan. "Is it real?" she asked him. Ryan looked like a man watching a building collapse in slow motion and understanding that he is inside it. He looked at Emily. He looked at his mother. Margaret had appeared at the edge of the room, and her face was a study in a particular kind of terror that Emily recognized now as guilt. And then he looked back at Madison. "I didn't know," he said. "Madison, I swear to you, I didn't know. You didn't know that you were living on someone else's land." Madison's voice was very quiet now, the quiet that is more frightening than shouting. "You didn't know that the title to this property wasn't clean. Your family has been here for decades, Ryan, and you're telling me none of you—" "I didn't know," he said again. Madison looked at him for a long, level moment. Then she looked at her father's back, still on the phone. Then she looked down at the flowers she was holding. She set them on the altar. "Call my car," she said to no one in particular, but someone behind her immediately moved to comply. "I need to change." "Madison." Ryan reached for her arm. She stepped away from him without looking at him. "Don't." One word. Absolute and final. She walked up the aisle without rushing. 400 guests watched her go. She did not look back. Ryan stood at the altar alone. He turned to Emily, and in his face she saw something she had not expected, not the entitled fury of a man who had been caught, but something more broken than that, something almost young, like a boy who had made a catastrophic decision on behalf of his family and was only now in this moment understanding the full weight of what that decision had cost. "Emily." His voice cracked on her name. "Emily, I need you to understand. My family was going to lose everything. My mother, the estate, everything my grandfather built, everything we had. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't—" "I know," she said. He blinked. "I know you were scared," she said. "I know your family had debt and pressure and that you made a choice you thought was the only one available to you. I understand the calculation you made. You looked at me, and you looked at Madison's money, and you decided that love wasn't a sufficient asset." She held his gaze. "What I need you to understand is that you made that calculation about a woman who was worth more than everything your family ever had, and you didn't know. And that's not the tragedy, Ryan. The tragedy is that it wouldn't have mattered if you had known, because you had already decided what I was worth." He stared at her. "You didn't leave me because I was poor," she said. "You left me because you thought I was." The room was so quiet that the words seemed to stay in the air after she spoke them. Ryan's face crumpled. From the edge of the room, a sound not loud but audible in the silence. Emily turned her head slightly. Margaret Whitmore was standing near the doorway where she had appeared, and she was not crying, but she had put one hand over her mouth, and in her eyes was something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or the recognition of how completely and irreversibly she had destroyed everything she had tried to protect. Carl Brewer materialized at Emily's shoulder. "The eviction notice has been served," he said quietly. "The estate manager has acknowledged receipt. We have until end of business today for the property to be vacated." Emily nodded. She looked around this room one last time. At the flowers, the chairs, the frozen tableau of 400 people who had come to watch a transaction disguised as a wedding. At the string quartet, who were sitting with their instruments in their laps and their mouths slightly open. At the catering staff, standing at the edges holding champagne flutes that would not now be raised. She looked at Ryan one last time. "I hope," she said, "that whatever comes next for you is something you actually chose, not something your family chose for you, not something money chose for you." A pause. "You deserved better than what your mother made you into. I just couldn't be the one to save you from it." She turned and walked back up the aisle. The 400 guests parted for her. No one spoke. A few people, women mostly of a certain age, had tears on their faces. And Emily noticed this and was moved by it in a way she hadn't expected. There was something in this that went beyond her own story, she thought. There was something in it that resonated with anyone who had ever been told their love wasn't worth enough. She stepped out into the October air. Patricia was standing outside near the edge of the drive in her good coat. When she saw Emily, she walked directly to her, and without a word, she opened her arms, and Emily, who had held herself together through 6 weeks of preparation and 3 hours of the most consequential morning of her life, let herself be held for exactly 30 seconds. Then she stepped back, squared her shoulders. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Patricia agreed. Carl appeared beside them. "Harlan Carlisle has already called 4 separate attorneys. He's threatening a countersuit for interference with contractual relations." "Good," Emily said. "Let him file. Every filing goes on public record." "His first attorney told him on the call, I have the transcript, his phone wasn't secure, that the property claim is airtight, and that suing will cost more than accepting the loss." "His first attorney," Emily said, "is smarter than he is." Vivian came out behind Carl, already on her phone, and gave Emily a look that communicated both satisfaction and the fact that the work was not finished, that it was in many ways only beginning, that there were months of legal process ahead and countermoves to anticipate and 100 details to manage. Emily read all of that in one glance and nodded. She knew. She had always known that today was not an ending. Today was a confirmation, a declaration, a moment that would be referenced in every legal proceeding and public record going forward as the day Emily Catherine Sterling reclaimed what was hers. She turned back toward the convoy. In the second SUV, she settled into her seat and let out one long, controlled breath. Marcus, sitting across from her with his briefcase finally relaxed in his lap, looked at her with an expression of someone who has just witnessed something he will describe to people for the rest of his life. "Ms. Sterling," he said carefully, "are you all right?" Emily looked out the window at the estate, her estate growing smaller as the car moved down the private road toward the gate. "Yes," she said, and she meant it in a way that went all the way down. "What happens now?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, something that was almost a smile reached her eyes. "Now," she said, "we go to work." The work, as Emily had put it to Marcus in the back of that SUV, turned out to be something that didn't stop for weekends. The morning after the wedding that wasn't Emily was back in Vivian's conference room at 7:30, coffee in hand, case files open in front of her, while outside the city was still deciding whether to fully wake up. The legal proceedings that had been set in motion were moving now with the momentum of something that had been building for a very long time and had finally found its direction, and there was no pausing it, no slowing it, no stepping back to breathe. There was only forward. The media had gotten hold of the story within 12 hours. Carl had anticipated this and had prepared Emily for it, but the reality of seeing your name in headlines was different from being told to expect it. The first article appeared on a major financial news site at 9 p.m., the night of the wedding, under a headline that was restrained by the standards of what followed. By the next morning, the story had been picked up by 3 national outlets, 2 international ones, and approximately half of the social media universe, each of them adding their own layer of interpretation to what had happened in that ceremony room. Sterling Heir reclaims estate at Billionaire's wedding was the polite version. Other versions were considerably less polite about Ryan, about Harlan Carlisle, and about the Whitmore family's 50-year occupation of land that wasn't theirs. Emily did not read most of them. She had enough to do. Harlan Carlisle had retained 4 separate law firms by the morning after the wedding. This was, as Vivian explained with the calm of someone who had seen powerful men panic before, actually a sign of weakness rather than strength. A man who knew what he was doing hired 1 firm and trusted them. A man who was afraid hired 4 and hoped the volume would compensate for the vulnerability. "He's going to throw everything he has at us," Vivian told her at the 7:30 briefing. "Fraud claims, harassment, interference with business relations. He may also try to challenge the forensic authentication of the land charter." "Can he succeed on any of those?" Emily asked. "No," Vivian said flatly, "but he can make things slower and more expensive and more exhausting. That's the strategy. Not to win, to wear you down." Emily looked at her steadily. "I've been worn down before," she said. "I recovered." Vivian almost smiled. "I know. I'm telling you so you're prepared, not so you're afraid." The first countersuit landed 2 days later. Harlan Carlisle's primary firm filed a 120-page complaint alleging fraudulent misrepresentation, tortious interference, and conspiracy to defraud. It named Emily Vivian Carl Brewer, Daniel Forsyth, and 3 members of the forensic authentication team. Emily read a summary of it over lunch at her desk and then set it aside and went back to the document she had been reviewing before Carl brought it in. "You're not going to react to this?" Carl asked. "I just did," she said. "I read it. I'm not worried about it. Tell Vivian to respond." Carl looked at her for a moment with an expression that was becoming familiar, the expression of a man who had spent 30 years in adversarial situations and occasionally encountered someone whose composure he found genuinely surprising. "You know," he said, "most clients, when they see a filing like that with their name on it, they have a significant reaction." "I'm sure they do," Emily said. "What else do you have for me?" What he had for her was the update she had actually been waiting for. The federal investigation that had been opened on the basis of Vivian's referral covering the financial conspiracy surrounding the Sterling estate in the years following the yacht accident had expanded significantly. What had begun as an inquiry into Gerald Ashby, the former attorney who had met with Margaret Whitmore in the estate library 8 years ago, had now grown to encompass a network of transactions and communications that stretched back nearly 20 years. Carl sat down across from her and opened his folder. "The federal investigators found the money trail," he said. Ashby wasn't working alone. He was part of a small group, 3 people in total, who had been systematically working to ensure that any claims against the assets held in trust for the Sterling heir would be made impossible to pursue. They've been doing it for 2 decades, falsified records, suppressed documents, and in at least 2 instances they made payments. Emily set down her pen. "Payments to whom?" she asked. Carl met her eyes. "One payment was made to a private records firm that was responsible for managing the archive of the original Sterling family documentation. Several key documents originals that would have made your identity verifiable much earlier were reclassified as lost or destroyed." "They weren't lost," Emily said. "Emily." "No, they were moved. The investigators found them in a storage facility in New Jersey, sealed in archival containers, misfiled under a completely different family name." He paused. "The second payment was made directly." He didn't continue immediately, and the pause was deliberate. "Carl," Emily said quietly, "who received the second payment?" "Margaret Whitmore," he said. 15 years ago, $120,000 transferred through a series of holding accounts that were designed to obscure the origin. The investigators have the full transaction chain." He paused again. "In exchange for that payment, Margaret Whitmore provided written confirmation to Ashby's group that, and I'm quoting from the documented communication, the individual known to me as Emily is not in contact with any legal representatives and has no knowledge of her origins. She gave them regular updates, at least 6 times over a 15-year period. The room was very quiet. Emily absorbed this information with the stillness of someone who has been trained by weeks of legal preparation and a lifetime of learning to process hard things, not to let shock dictate behavior. She had known Margaret was involved. She had known since Vivian told her in this same room weeks ago that Margaret had sold information. But knowing something in general and knowing it in forensic documented specific detail were different things. $120,000, 6 updates over 15 years. Margaret Whitmore had not simply stumbled into a piece of information and made one terrible decision. She had maintained an active relationship with the people who had been working to ensure Emily never discovered who she was. For 15 years. While Emily had sat across from her at dinner tables, while Emily had brought her flowers and remembered her birthday and tried to make her smile, while Margaret had looked at her with that composed, silver-haired grace and accepted her gifts and eaten her food, and all the while had been feeding information to the people who wanted to keep Emily ignorant and powerless and small, Emily picked up her pen again. "Add it to the federal referral," she said. "All of it. The payment, the communications, the timeline." Carl nodded. "Margaret is going to be interviewed by federal investigators," he said. "Given the documentary evidence, they're not treating this as a civil matter." "I know," Emily said. "Ryan doesn't know about his mother's role yet," Carl added carefully. "At least not the full scope of it. The investigators haven't approached him formally." Emily was quiet for a moment. She thought about Ryan, not the Ryan who had stood at the altar in a morning suit, and not the Ryan who had watched his world collapse in front of 400 witnesses, but the Ryan she had known for 5 years. The man who had held her hand at his grandfather's funeral and cried without embarrassment. The man who had driven 3 hours in the middle of the night once because she'd called him frightened and sick and alone, and he'd come without being asked twice. That man had existed. She had not invented him. He had also chosen greed over love. He had chosen his family's financial comfort over the woman he claimed to love. And his mother had been feeding information to dangerous people for 15 years. And he had benefited from the stability that money provided, even if he hadn't known where it came from. "When the investigators approach him," Emily said, "I don't want anyone from our team to interfere with that process in either direction. If he has information that's relevant, they need to be able to get to it without any pressure from us." Carl nodded. "Understood." "And Carl makes sure Patricia is kept updated. Not on the legal details. Just make sure she knows she's not forgotten in all of this." Something in Carl's professionally neutral expression shifted briefly toward warmth. "Already done," he said. The weeks that followed moved at a speed that Emily later struggled to describe accurately to anyone who hadn't lived inside it. Legal filings responses, counter-responses depositions, expert witness preparations, media statements carefully crafted by Vivian's communications team, financial forensics being assembled by accountants who charged by the hour and were worth every cent. Emily moved through all of it with a focus that surprised even herself. She had always been capable. She had never known before what she was capable of when the stakes were actually hers. Harlan Carlisle's countersuit was systematically dismantled over the course of 3 weeks. His legal team argued at every point and lost at every point. The DNA evidence alone was so comprehensively documented that the fraud allegation couldn't survive contact with it. The land charter authentication had been performed by credentials that Carlisle's attorneys couldn't credibly attack. One by one, the claims were dismissed. Harlan took it badly. He was photographed leaving his attorney's office after the 3rd dismissal, looking like a man who had aged 5 years in as many weeks. The financial press was not kind. His reputation as someone who could buy his way out of any situation was being publicly and methodically dismantled, and there was nothing he could do about it because the problem wasn't a situation that money could fix. The problem was that the law was correct, and the law did not care about his net worth. Madison had not spoken publicly since the wedding. She had returned to her father's estate in Connecticut and was reported by people who knew her to be furious, not heartbroken, not devastated, but furious in the way of a woman who had been embarrassed in front of 400 people and who intended to do something about that feeling eventually on her own terms and in her own time. She filed no legal actions against Emily. She made no public statements. She was simply, as far as the situation was concerned, gone. Ryan was not gone. Ryan called Emily's personal phone on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the wedding. The call came at 7:42, which told her he had been awake for some time before making it. She saw his name on the screen, and she sat with it for 2 full rings before she answered. "Ryan," she said. "Emily." His voice was rough in the way that voices get when someone hasn't been sleeping, when the internal life has been demanding more than the body can quietly process. "I need to talk to you, please. Just please give me 10 minutes. She looked at her case files spread across the desk in front of her. She thought about Vivian, who would advise her not to take this call without counsel present. She took it anyway. 10 minutes, she said. He exhaled, a long, ragged sound. I know you have every reason not to hear anything I say right now. I know that. I'm not calling to make excuses or to ask you for anything I'm not. I just need you to know that I found out about my mother. Emily was still. The investigators came to the house yesterday, he said. The house I'm staying in now, which is it's not important. They told me about the payments, about the communications, about what she did for 15 years. His voice broke on the last sentence, not dramatically, but in the way of a man who has been holding something very heavy for 24 hours and is reaching the limit of his ability to hold it. Emily, I swear to you, I swear on anything you'll believe from me, which I know isn't much right now I didn't know. I had no idea she was involved in anything like that. I believe you, Emily said. A pause, brief surprised. You do? Yes, she said. The evidence is consistent with someone who kept you deliberately uninformed. That was her strategy, Ryan, not just with me, with you. He was quiet for a moment. She's my mother, he said, and the words carried a particular weight, not an excuse, not a defense, just the statement of a terrible fact that he was still trying to integrate into his understanding of his life. She was protecting the family. That's what she always said. Everything she did was for the family. I know, Emily said gently, and that's the most heartbreaking part of it. She convinced herself that what she was doing was love. Is it? He stopped, started again. Is it going to be enough for them to arrest her? Emily measured her words carefully. I don't know what the investigators will decide. What I know is that I didn't make the referral to punish her. I made it because the information needed to be in front of the right people, and what they do with it is not in my hands. Ryan was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought the call might be over. Then he said, I've been thinking about what you said. At the estate, about why I left you. She waited. You were right, he said. About all of it. I didn't just choose Madison's money. I chose a version of you that I had constructed a version that was convenient for the choice I was already making. I told myself you'd be fine, that you were strong, that you'd move on, that you were... He stopped. That you were ordinary enough that losing you wouldn't cost me anything important. Emily closed her eyes. And then I stood in that room, he said, and I watched you walk toward me, and I understood that I had never known who you were at all. Not because of the estate or the dynasty or any of that, but because a woman who walks into a room the way you walked into that room on that morning was never ordinary. I just needed it to cost me everything to see it. The silence between them was not hostile. It was not comfortable. It was the particular silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a distance that has been made permanent. I'm sorry, Emily, he said. Not for the legal situation, not for the estate or the money or any of the things that I've lost. I'm sorry that I chose wrong when what I was choosing was you. She let the words be real. She didn't dismiss them. She didn't minimize them. She let them land and she sat with them for a moment because he meant them, and she was not a person who could be unmoved by genuine remorse, even from people who had hurt her profoundly. I hear you, she said finally, and I believe that you mean it. But it's too late, he said, not a question. It was too late the moment you made the choice, she said. Not because I'm unforgiving, because some things, once they're done, change the shape of everything that comes after them. You can grieve that. I have. But you can't undo it. He didn't speak for a moment. What do you do, he asked quietly, when you realize that the worst thing you ever did was also the thing that can never be fixed? Emily thought about Helen, about the attic, about the iron chest and the letter written in handwriting she had known her whole life from a woman who had also done a complicated thing out of love and fear and the desperate human impulse to protect. "You decide who you're going to be on the other side of it," she said. "That's all there is." She ended the call gently. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the office, and then she opened the next file on her desk because the work was still going and she was still the person responsible for it. 2 days later, Margaret Whitmore was formally interviewed by federal investigators. Carl called Emily at noon with the update, his voice carrying the particular weight of news that is both expected and significant. "She confirmed the payments," he said. "She confirmed the communications. She's retained a criminal defense attorney." Emily absorbed this. "There's one more thing," Carl said carefully. "One of the communications Margaret sent to Ashby's group investigators found it this morning. In the recovered archive, it was sent the week after you and Ryan got engaged." Emily stilled. "What did it say?" she asked. Carl paused. "It said, and I'm quoting, 'The situation remains contained. She has no knowledge of her origins and no professional legal relationships that would facilitate discovery. Engagement to my son is a complication, but not a threat. She is not looking.'" The room was very quiet. "She watched you get engaged to her son," Carl said, "and her response was to send a reassurance to the people who had paid her to keep you quiet." Emily pressed her hand flat on the desk in front of her. She thought about the engagement dinner Margaret had hosted, the pearls she had worn, the toast she had made gracious and warm about Ryan finding a good woman, the way she had held Emily's hand briefly at the end of the evening and said something about being glad her son had found someone steady. She had been calculating Emily's threat level while she held her hand. "Okay," Emily said. Her voice was even. "Okay," Carl asked. "Emily, this is—" "I know what it is," she said. "I've known on some level since the attic. The depth of it is new. The fact of it isn't." She looked at the wall. "Does Ryan know about this specific communication?" "Not yet." "Don't tell him yet," she said. "Let him have a few more days before he has to process that particular detail. He's already dealing with enough." Carl was quiet for a moment. "That's generous," he said carefully, "given the circumstances." "It's not generosity," Emily said. "It's just he's already lost everything. Adding that specific piece today doesn't change the legal outcome. It just adds suffering." She paused. "There's been enough suffering." She closed the file in front of her and opened the next one. The legal resolution came in stages, rather than all at once, which was how major cases almost always ended, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of decisions that each settled one more piece of a very large puzzle. The property claim was formally adjudicated in Emily's favor 6 weeks after the wedding. The Whitmore family's eviction from the estate was confirmed and completed. The asset freeze was formalized into a full seizure pending the resolution of the fraud investigation. Harlan Carlisle's final appeal on the $52 million transfer was denied on a Friday afternoon in November. His attorney called Vivian to convey the decision, and Vivian called Emily 60 seconds later. "It's done," she said. "The full amount?" Emily asked. "Every dollar." His last argument was that the transfer predated the formal property claim filing and therefore couldn't be subject to it. The judge disagreed. A pause. Emphatically. Emily was standing in the hallway of the legal offices when the call came. She leaned her shoulder against the wall and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. "What does he do now?" she asked. "His attorneys are recommending he accept the outcome and focus on limiting further damage. Whether he takes that advice—" Vivian's tone suggested she had doubts. "He's not a man who accepts things easily." "No," Emily agreed, "but he's going to have to learn." Margaret Whitmore was formally charged with fraud and conspiracy in the second week of November. The charges were federal, which meant they were serious, and the evidence against her was the kind that forensic accountants and federal investigators had spent months building into something that was, in Vivian's assessment, essentially airtight. She appeared at her arraignment with a defense attorney and an expression that had finally, after weeks of public exposure, settled into something Emily could only identify as diminished. The composed, silver-haired woman who had held court at dinner tables and made Emily feel perpetually insufficient had contracted somehow. She looked like someone who had been carrying a very large thing for a very long time and had finally been forced to put it down, and the absence of its weight, rather than providing relief, had simply revealed how much it had been holding her up. Ryan was not charged. The investigation found no credible evidence that he had known about his mother's activities. He cooperated fully with federal investigators, which Carl reported to Emily with a note of something approaching respect in his voice, because cooperating fully when cooperation might feel like betrayal is not something everyone manages. He had moved to a small apartment in Pittsburgh. He was working. Emily did not know the details and did not seek them. What Carl knew he offered. What he didn't, she didn't push for. One evening in late November, Emily received a handwritten letter. No return address, but the postmark was Pittsburgh. She knew the handwriting. It was 2 pages. She read it once slowly, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of her desk, where she kept the things she wasn't ready to discard and wasn't ready to examine too closely. He did not ask for anything. He explained nothing. He simply wrote about what he was learning about himself in the quiet of a small apartment in a city where no one knew his name. And at the end of the 2nd page, he wrote, "I think about what you said, about deciding who you're going to be on the other side. I'm trying to figure that out. I hope you've already figured it out, because you deserve to know who you are." She sat with that for a long time. She thought about who she was. She thought about Emily Sterling of Maine, who had grown up in a small, blue-shuttered house with a woman who had loved her perfectly and imperfectly and completely. She thought about the girl who had been thrown into the world at 30, with 2 suitcases and a broken engagement, and no idea that beneath a leaking roof in an attic, everything that had ever been taken from her was waiting to be found. She thought about what she was going to do now that it had been found. She already knew. She had known for weeks, since a quiet afternoon when she had sat in Vivian's conference room after a long day of depositions and looked out at the city and thought, what is all of this for, if not for something? The estate was hers. The money was hers. The name was hers. The history was hers. And she was going to do something with it that the people who had tried to keep her from it could never have imagined and never could have prevented. The first thing Emily did when the legal dust finally settled was drive back to Maine. Not to the estate, not to any of the offices or conference rooms that had become her world for the past several months. She drove to Helen's small house with the blue shutters and the birch trees and the sound of the water, and she let herself in with the key she had never returned to the hook by the door, and she sat in Helen's kitchen in the same chair she had sat in as a child doing homework, and she allowed herself for the first time since October to simply be still. It was December now. The water outside was gray and serious, and the birch trees had lost their leaves, and everything was quiet in the particular way that coastal Maine is quiet in winter, not empty, but settled. Like the world had exhaled. She made tea in Helen's pot, the old ceramic one with the chip on the lid that Helen had never replaced, because she said it gave it character. She sat with both hands around the mug, and she looked at the kitchen, at the familiar placement of things at the window over the sink, at the small photograph on the refrigerator that had been there for as long as Emily could remember, of the 2 of them at a county fair when Emily was 7 years old, both of them laughing at something out of frame. She talked to Helen again. She did this regularly now, not with any superstition about being heard, but because the habit of it was real, and the comfort of it was real, and she had decided that things which provide genuine comfort are worth keeping. "I think I know what I'm going to do," she said to the kitchen. "I think I've known for a while. I just needed to be here to say it out loud." She finished her tea. She washed the mug. She put it back on the shelf exactly where it belonged. Then she picked up her phone and called Vivian. "I'm ready to talk about the estate," she said. Vivian was quiet for a beat, not surprised. She had the quality Emily had come to appreciate deeply of a person who pays attention, and therefore is rarely caught entirely off guard. "I'll clear my afternoon," she said. They met in New York 2 days later, not in the formal conference room, but in a smaller office that Vivian used for conversations that were more personal than procedural. Emily arrived with a single legal pad covered in her own handwriting, the kind of dense, organized notes that come from someone who has been thinking something through for a very long time. She set it on the table between them. "I don't want to live there," Emily said. This was the first thing, and it needed to be the first thing because everything else followed from it. Vivian looked at her. At the estate. At the estate. I thought about it. I imagined it. And I understand why people would expect me to want it, to reclaim it, to live in it, to make it mine in the most visible possible way. She looked at the legal pad. But it's not what I want. What do you want? Vivian asked. Emily turned the legal pad so Vivian could read it. Vivian read in silence for almost 3 minutes, which for a woman who processed information at the speed she did was significant. The Margaret Sterling Foundation, Vivian said. Named for Helen, Emily said. Her last name was Sterling. That was a coincidence that I have decided to stop calling a coincidence. She paused. She gave me everything. The least I can do is give her name to something that lasts. Vivian looked at the legal pad again. Educational Center, Research Institution, scholarships for working-class students, housing for young researchers and scholars, a historical archive for the Sterling family legacy open to the public. The renovation budget alone, Vivian said carefully, given the scale of what you're describing. I know the numbers, Emily said. I've had an architect and a nonprofit consultant working on the feasibility for 3 weeks. It's viable. The endowment from the recovered estate assets will cover the construction, the operational costs for the first 10 years, and the initial scholarship fund. She paused. I want it to be the best educational institution of its kind in the country. Not a good one. The best. Vivian set the legal pad down. Emily, she said, and this was one of those moments when Vivian's professional composure became something adjacent to genuine emotion. The people who tried to keep you from this, from your name, your inheritance, your history, they would have used this estate to accumulate more wealth, more power, more of the same thing they already had. I know, Emily said, and you're going to turn it into something that gives other people the kind of access that you never had. That Helen never had, Emily corrected quietly. She was a brilliant woman who spent her life in service to wealthy families because no door was open to her that didn't require going in through the back. She protected me at the cost of her own story. Emily looked at her hands on the table. I can't give her her story back, but I can make sure the next generation of people like her, like me, before I knew who I was, have a door they can walk through. There was a moment of silence between them that was not awkward and not empty, but the kind of full-weighted silence that comes when something important has been said and received. I'll draw up the foundation documents, Vivian said. The announcement of the Margaret Sterling Foundation was made in January at a press event that Emily had worked with a communications team to design carefully. She stood at a podium, not at the estate that was still being prepared, but in a room in New York, and she spoke for 17 minutes without notes because she had lived every word of what she had to say and didn't need paper to remember it. She talked about Helen, about the house in Maine, about what it meant to grow up loved by someone who had sacrificed something enormous to provide that love. She talked about the iron chest in the attic and what she had found in it, not in the legal language she had been using for months, but in the plain human language of a woman describing the moment her life changed shape. She talked about what the foundation would do. The scholarship's full funding for 50 students per year from working-class backgrounds focused on research law history and public service, the residency program for early career researchers, the archive, the public educational programs. She did not talk about Ryan. She did not talk about Harlan Carlisle. She did not talk about the wedding or the eviction or the asset freeze. Those things were public record. Anyone who wanted to read them could find them. She had said everything she needed to say in those conference rooms and courtrooms and in the 2 sentences she had delivered at the altar. There was nothing left to add. When the press event was over and the questions had been answered and the photographers had taken their photographs, Patricia, who had been sitting in the 3rd row in her good coat, because Emily had asked her specifically to come, found Emily near the exit and held her by both arms and looked at her in the way that only certain older women know how to look at you, which is to say completely and without reservation. Your mother would be so proud of you, Patricia said. Emily didn't trust her voice immediately. Which one? She managed after a moment. Patricia smiled. Both of them, she said. Obviously. The renovation of the estate took 14 months. Emily visited regularly, but lived elsewhere. She had taken an apartment in the city, modest by the standards of someone with her resources, because modesty in that regard felt right to her. She didn't need the square footage of a dynasty. She needed a place to sleep and work and come home to, and the apartment provided that. The estate was not her home. It was something better. She was present for every significant decision in the renovation. She walked through the rooms with the architect and the foundation's first executive director, a woman named Dr. Simone Hayes, who had spent 20 years running educational nonprofits and who had cried quietly but visibly during the press event in January and then composed herself and sent Emily a 3-page letter outlining exactly what she would do if given the opportunity to lead the foundation. Emily had hired her the same week. "The library," Emily said on one of the early walkthroughs. She was standing in what had been the estate's formal library, a large room with floor-to-ceiling shelving and 2 fireplaces and windows that looked out over the grounds. "I want this to be the heart of it, not the showpiece, the actual working center. I want scholars in here every day. I want the shelves full of things people actually use." Dr. Hayes was taking notes. "We've already begun coordinating with 3 university libraries about archive sharing," she said, "and the Columbia professor who verified the land charter has offered to donate a significant collection of his personal research materials." Emily thought about that professor, a patient-precise man named Dr. Franklin Webb, who had written 500 words about a land charter and had probably saved her life's direction with them. She made a note to call him personally. "What about the scholarship criteria?" Dr. Hayes asked. "Financial need is the first criterion," Emily said. "Not grades, not test scores as a primary measure, financial need. Because the students who need this most are often the ones whose grades don't reflect their actual intelligence. They reflect the fact that they were working 2 jobs to keep the lights on while they studied." She paused. "I know what that's like. I've met enough people who live that way to know it's not a reflection of ability. It's a reflection of circumstance." Dr. Hayes looked at her. "You're describing the founding philosophy of a genuinely different kind of institution," she said. "Good," Emily said. "That's what I'm trying to build." The news about Margaret Whitmore's legal proceedings had continued to develop in the months since the initial charges. Her trial was set for the spring. The federal case against Gerald Ashby and his associates had moved with considerable speed, given the quality of the documentary evidence. 2 of the 3 members of the conspiracy had entered plea agreements. Ashby himself was contesting the charges which his attorneys had advised against, but which Emily had been told was consistent with his character. A man who had spent 30 years believing he was smarter than the systems around him was not easily persuaded to concede. Emily had not attended any of the proceedings. She had provided statements when required, had made witnesses available, had cooperated fully with federal investigators. But she had not gone to the courtroom. Not because she lacked the nerve, because she had made a decision early on that her presence at those proceedings would signal to the world that she was primarily interested in punishment, and that wasn't the signal she wanted to send. She was interested in accountability. That was different. Accountability was about the record, about the truth being established and confirmed and made permanent. Punishment was about emotion. She had moved past the emotion mostly. What remained was something cleaner and more durable. Carl Brewer called her on a Thursday morning in March with an update she had been expecting, but that still landed with force. "Margaret took a plea," he said. Emily set down her coffee. "When?" she asked. "This morning. Her attorney reached an agreement with the federal prosecutors. She's pleading guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud and 1 count of obstruction. In exchange, 2 of the more serious charges are being dropped." What does she get? 18 months likely served in a minimum security facility, followed by 3 years of supervised release, and she's required to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation into Ashby's network. Emily absorbed this. "Ryan knows," she asked. "He was informed this morning before the agreement was finalized," Carl said. "His attorney tells me he didn't try to stop it. He said—" Carl paused slightly. "He said he wanted her to do whatever gave her the best chance at some kind of life afterward." Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment. "Okay," she said. "There's one more thing," Carl said. He had the same delivery he always used for things that mattered, factual, steady, but with a weight in the pauses, that told you to pay attention. Part of Margaret's cooperation agreement includes a full accounting of everything she knows about the events surrounding the yacht accident 25 years ago. The investigators believe there may be information she has about the original incident itself, about whether the accident was actually an accident. The silence was absolute. "They think it was deliberate?" Emily asked. Her voice was completely controlled. "They don't know yet. That's what Margaret's testimony is intended to help establish. What the investigators have found in the Ashby documents suggests that the group he worked for had significant financial motivation to ensure that Catherine and Robert Sterling did not survive long enough to formally restructure their estate planning, which they had apparently begun doing shortly before the accident." A pause. "Emily, I want to be clear. This is an active investigation and we don't have conclusions. But if you want to be kept informed as developments emerge..." "Yes," she said immediately. "Every development, regardless of what it is." "Understood," Carl said. She sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended, and she felt the full weight of what she had just heard settle into her body. The possibility that her parents had not simply died in a terrible accident, that the people who had grown wealthy from the vacuum their deaths created had not simply been opportunists, but something worse. She thought about Catherine and Robert Sterling, the young couple in the formal photograph she had found at the bottom of the iron chest. She had had that photograph framed. It sat on the desk in her apartment next to a smaller informal photo of Helen laughing at something out of frame. She looked at that photograph now across the room. "I'm going to find out," she said, to both of them, to the two women who had in different ways given her her life. The foundation's opening ceremony was held on a Saturday morning in late April. The grounds were full: journalists, local officials, university representatives, and the first class of scholarship recipients, 23 young people ranging in age from 18 to 26, who had been selected from over 4,000 applicants, and who were standing in clusters in the spring air with expressions that Emily recognized because she had worn it herself, the particular expression of someone standing somewhere they never expected to be allowed. Emily had insisted that the ceremony be simple. No theatrical staging, no elaborate speeches from dignitaries. She spoke first, and she spoke last, and in between she asked 3 of the scholarship recipients to speak, which had not been part of the original program plan, and had required some rapid reordering by the communications team, but which felt more important than anything else they could have put in that time slot. The first was a 20-year-old from rural Kentucky named Marcus. Not the same Marcus as Vivian's junior attorney, though Emily had noticed the coincidence and found it quietly pleasing, who had been working night shifts at a distribution warehouse while taking online courses, and who had written in his application essay about his grandmother who had always told him that education was the one thing no one could repossess. Emily stood to the side while he spoke, and she listened with her whole body, the way you listen when something matters. When the 3 students had finished, she returned to the podium. She looked out at the assembled faces, at Dr. Hayes, who was crying again openly and without apology, at Vivian, who was not crying but whose expression was the closest to unguarded that Emily had ever seen it, at Carl Brewer standing near the back with his arms folded, looking like a man who would deny having any feelings about anything if asked, but who was in fact having quite significant feelings. At Patricia, who was in the front row again, in the good coat again, with an expression of such complete and unqualified satisfaction that it made Emily's chest ache in the best possible way. My mother, my adoptive mother. Helen used to say something that I didn't fully understand until I was standing in an attic at 2 a.m. reading documents by flashlight, Emily said. She used to say, "The thing that was taken from you is not the measure of what you're worth. It's only the measure of how badly someone else wanted what you had." She paused. "I spent the first part of my adult life not knowing who I was, and I spent a significant part of the last year fighting for the right to be that person, publicly, legally, unambiguously. But the part that matters, the part that Helen taught me, that the woman in that iron chest of journals, taught me that the people who tried to keep me small and ignorant and grateful for whatever scraps I was offered, taught me by failing, is that what you do with what you recover is the whole point." She looked at the 23 young people in the front section of the assembled crowd. "The people who built their comfort on someone else's inheritance," she said, "lost everything, not because I took it from them, because the truth has a way of being patient that the greedy and the fearful never seem to account for. It waits, it accumulates, and eventually no amount of money or influence or carefully maintained silence can hold it back. She paused again, letting the words settle. This foundation, she said, is not a monument to what was taken from me. It is a monument to what could not be taken. To the woman who pulled a child out of cold water because it was the right thing to do and never asked for anything in return. To every person in this country who has ever been told that their worth could be measured in a bank account and who has refused quietly or loudly or desperately to believe it. She looked at the photograph of Helen on the display easel near the entrance, a large formal print that had been made from the best copy they had of an old photograph Helen, at perhaps 45, looking directly at the camera with the expression that Emily had loved her whole life. Not smiling exactly. Something better than smiling. Certain. Like a woman who knows her own value and has long since stopped requiring anyone else to confirm it. Her name was Helen Sterling, Emily said. She was nobody's heiress. She was nobody's legacy. She was a working woman who made an extraordinary choice one October night and spent the rest of her life living with it and loving me and keeping me safe until she couldn't anymore. Her voice held. I am here, Emily said, because she decided I was worth saving. Everything I build from this moment forward is because she believed that was true. The ceremony ended and the crowd moved into the reception, and the spring afternoon unfolded in the way that spring afternoons do, when everything that has been difficult has been survived and something new has genuinely begun. Emily moved through conversations with the ease of a woman who has found her footing, shaking hands, answering questions, listening to the scholarship recipients with real attention when they told her about their plans and their families and the things that had brought them to this point. She found herself toward the end of the afternoon standing near the window of the library, her library, though she still wasn't entirely used to that word, with a cup of tea going cold in her hand alone for the first time in hours. Dr. Hayes appeared beside her. How does it feel? She asked. Emily looked at the room, at the shelves beginning to fill with books, at the long reading tables that would by September be occupied by the first cohort of research residents at the plaque near the door that bore Helen's name in clean, permanent letters. It feels, Emily said slowly, like the right size. Dr. Hayes smiled. The right size. I spent a long time thinking about what I would do if I ever had enough, Emily said. Enough money, enough security, enough ground under my feet, and I always thought it would feel large, expansive, like finally having room to spread out. She looked at the plaque. But it doesn't feel large. It feels exact, like something that was always the right shape for where it was going to go. I just had to survive long enough to put it there. Dr. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Helen chose well, she said. Yes, Emily agreed. She did. Carl found her an hour later near the exit as the last guests were beginning to leave. Update, he said with his characteristic lack of preamble. The federal investigators have completed their preliminary review of Margaret's testimony regarding the yacht accident. I'm told they're treating it as credible and opening a formal inquiry. Emily met his eyes. Into what specifically? Into whether the navigation failure on that yacht was deliberately engineered, Carl said. Margaret has provided the name of a man she heard Ashby reference on 2 separate occasions as having been involved in the events of that night. Investigators are pursuing it. Emily absorbed this in the way she had learned to absorb significant information, letting it land fully, not deflecting it, not minimizing it, but also not letting it destabilize her in the moment. Then we pursue it, she said. It could be a long process, Carl warned. 25-year-old events. Some witnesses are gone. The physical evidence is limited. I know, she said. I've been patient before. Carl looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to recognize as the closest he came to saying something personal. You have, he agreed. She shook his hand, which was not their usual mode, but something about the afternoon called for it, and he accepted it without comment. She walked out to the car that was waiting for her. She got in. The driver pulled away from the estate, and she looked out the window as the building grew smaller behind them, as the grounds receded as the gate passed. She did not feel the complicated grief she had expected to feel when the day ended. She had prepared herself for a kind of melancholy, the particular sadness of victories that arrive too late for the people you wanted to share them with. And it was there, yes. It was there in the way that Helen's absence was always there, a permanent silence in the frequency where her voice used to be. But beneath it, and stronger than it was, something else. Something Emily had not had a name for until this moment, sitting in the back of a car in the April evening, with the foundation behind her and a federal investigation ahead of her and the rest of her life in every direction she looked. The word she decided was ready. She was ready for all of it. For the investigation and whatever it uncovered. For the work of running a foundation that was going to change things for people who needed things changed. For the years of building something that would outlast her, that would carry Helen's name forward into a future that neither of them could have imagined from a small kitchen in Maine with 2 cups of tea and a county fair photograph on a refrigerator. She was ready in the way that you are when you have survived the worst thing you thought could happen to you and discovered on the other side of it that the worst thing was also the beginning of everything that mattered. Ryan Whitmore was working nights in Pittsburgh. Harlan Carlisle was fighting battles in boardrooms that no longer touched her. Margaret was beginning a legal process that was hers to navigate now, and the people who had built their security on her ignorance were discovering one by one that the thing they had tried to contain was not containable. It never had been. Emily Sterling had been thrown out of her own legacy with 2 suitcases and a broken heart. She had come back with the truth. And the truth, as Helen had always known, was the one thing in this world that no amount of money power or carefully maintained silence can ever fully take from the person it belongs to.